Good afternoon and good morning for those joining from different communities around the country and world. We understand that we have nearly 2,000 friends registered for today's conversation. Thank you so much for joining our webinar about the field of philanthropy and how it is evolving in donor communities of color. Now, in light of all that is unfolding in Afghanistan, Haiti, and other impacted parts of the world right now, we'd like to begin our time together with a moment of silence to hold space. In our moment, we will recognize friends, family members, and colleagues who are experiencing troubling times in the world because of color, gender, and spiritual orientation. Let us have a moment of silence together. Thank you, everyone. I am Allison Reeves, Corporate Vice President at CCS, and I'm glad to introduce today's participants. Bo Rice is Principal and Managing Director of CCS, and he will serve as today's moderator. Dr. Una Osili is the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. A global expert on philanthropy and social innovation, she has more than 2 decades of experience in leadership, economic policy, and research across the public and private sectors. Many thanks to you, Dr. Osili, for making today's conversation possible. Next, we'll have Kat Rosqueta. Kat is the founding executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. Kat has held numerous civic leadership positions, and she currently serves as vice chair of the Board of Candid, which is a merger of Foundation Center and GuideStar. Candid is the world's largest source of information on nonprofits and foundations. In addition, Kat serves on the National Board of Greenlight Fund, a venture philanthropy fund dedicated to addressing urgent social needs in cities around the United States. And she also co-chairs Greenlight Fund Philadelphia. Kat, thank you for your leadership and for joining us today. Dr. Wayne Frederick was appointed the 17th president of Howard University in 2014, where he previously served as provost and chief academic officer. Most recently, the Howard University Board of Trustees selected Dr. Frederick to serve as the distinguished Charles R. Drew Professor of Surgery. Dr. Frederick received his Bachelor of Science and MD degrees from Howard University. He also earned a Master of Business Administration from Howard University School of Business in 2011. We are honored to have you with us today, Dr. Frederick. Patricia Eng is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, otherwise known as APIP. She comes to APIP after serving as Chief Service Officer at the Mayor's Office of the City of New York, where she worked to deepen and expand civic engagement through volunteer and service programs. A graduate of Hunter College, School of Social Work, and Princeton University, Pat studied community organizing and politics. She lives on the East Coast, where she participates in several social justice giving circles. Pat, thank you for your leadership, your fortitude, and your dedication to this work. Dawn Knickerbocker belongs to the Anishinaabe tribe, people from the White Earth Nation. She's also an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe from the Otter-tailed Pillager Band of Indians. Having spent over 20 years of her work life as a grassroots organizer on the front lines of Earth-related matters, Dawn is an activist, advocate, organizational strategist, and a leader in the philanthropic sector. She currently serves as the Vice President of Development and External Engagement for Native Americans in Philanthropy. Dawn, we appreciate your commitment to this field and to this movement. We are glad you are with us today. Jeannie Sager is the director of the Women's Philanthropy Institute, which is housed under the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Jeannie is a seasoned nonprofit executive with over 25 years of experience in healthcare, higher education, and independent school leadership. Jeannie earned her master's degree in philanthropic studies from Indiana University, where she was a Jane Addams Fellow, and she earned a bachelor's degree in international relations from Rollins College. She is on the advisory council for WOKE, women of color in fundraising and philanthropy. Thank you, Jeannie, for your leadership and guidance to so many areas of our field. We appreciate you being with us today. Thank you to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, project participants, and the Advisory Council for their commitment to this important research. And now to begin our conversation. The US population is more racially and ethnically diverse than ever before and is experiencing significant demographic shifts with implications for philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. With the onset of COVID-19 and the racial justice reckonings of the last year, communities of color are increasingly investing their time, talent, and treasure to make meaningful changes. Despite these trends, research on philanthropy across diverse communities continues to receive limited attention. Our goal today is to dive into qualitative themes around motivations and behaviors of donors of color, based on the report from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy entitled Everyday Donors of Color, and then to connect with our esteemed group of panelists to discuss how this information impacts today's philanthropic landscape. I'll now turn it over to Una for an overview of the report findings.
Greetings to all of you who've joined. It is such a pleasure and an honor to have this opportunity to partner with amazing colleagues from across the sector, and also special thanks to CCS for hosting us today. I bring you greetings from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. This is our first week back on campus, and we have record enrollments in our master's programs. In addition, our Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy, a one-of-a-kind institute that spotlights giving, research, training, and education about the ways that philanthropy is changing, is bringing new attention to the Lilly Family School. So greetings to begin. And I also want to thank everyone who contributed to this research project. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded this project. We're very grateful to them, but also all the donors and participants, as well as leaders from across the sector that supported this work. There is Greetings from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. This is our first week back on campus. We are so delighted to have this opportunity to share the research that has been taking place over the last year, and also to highlight the contributions of all those that participated. We want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding this project, several of our research team members who worked diligently over the past 12 to 18 months, and also our advisory council, both of researchers and practitioners that contributed to this important work. On the next slide, there's a list of all, it's not by any means exhaustive, but it does highlight how collaborative this research project was and how we hope it is just the start of more work in this area. And I also want to thank our CCS colleagues for hosting this very exciting forum, and all of you who've joined us from far and wide. I hold the distinction and honor actually of being the Dean's Fellow at the Mays Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. It's a one-of-a-kind institute at the Lilly Family School. It's provided an opportunity to shed light and bring new awareness to all the different ways that donors of color give in America. So with that as a bit of a background, let's get started. Let's dive right into the research findings. To begin with, I'd like to share just a brief outline for today's presentation. We'll start with the key takeaways and then walk you through the research questions, the methods that we used, and also end with implication. So let's move to the very next slide. in my research work as a scholar, but also work at the Lilly Family School, we definitely want to make sure that everyone who's joined us today emerges with some key findings. And I'd like to just share 4 of those, and also say that it was actually quite difficult to highlight just the main findings because there was so much to share from this research report. The very first finding is that philanthropy is broad, it is wide, it is deep, and that donors of color are engaged in multiple forms of generosity. And in fact, it is time to recognize and spotlight all the different ways that communities of color give. The second key finding is this research project was unique because it had both qualitative as well as quantitative themes. We learned that the motivations for giving are also quite diverse and complex, but they include the idea of faith-based giving, the need to lift up communities that have been left out of a lot of our let's say formal systems, self-help and reciprocity are key themes, and also the need to open opportunity and level the playing field. The third finding, and very important in our landscape today, is that technology is playing a game-changing role in how donors of color give. And then finally, and importantly, there is growing awareness of racial and social justice across all American donors, but especially in communities of color. And Black donors and Asian American donors were more likely to give to racial and social justice causes. So those are the main findings. Now, what I'd like to do is take you behind the scenes to how we got to these main findings. In addition to the work that you're going to hear today, there is a whole report that I hope you will download and spend time with following this presentation. So let us share some of those methods that were used and also the research question. So starting with the research questions, about a year ago, our team got together, we spent some time trying to highlight what the key themes and the research questions. What we realized was that there was very limited research on what motivates donors of color, especially in this changing landscape, what areas were they giving to, what specific tools and techniques donors of color were utilizing, and finally, how were donors of color engaged in giving to racial and social justice? The timing of these research questions was fortuitous. We had started to embark on this project prior to COVID-19, but as the events of 2020 unfolded and even beyond, we understood how timely and relevant these findings were. I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Wendy Chan, as well as Dr. Patricia Banks, who played a key role in this research project. And certainly as you read the report, you'll see more about all the different scholars that contributed. On the next slide, just a quick overview of the extensive work that took place over the past year. Dr. Wendy Chan undertook a systematic literature review of donors of color. And the main takeaway there is that this is an area that is under-researched, and there's a need for a lot more work to be done to understand how our nation's changing demographics are impacting philanthropy. Importantly, the school partnered with the NORC National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago to conduct a nationally representative survey of US households in September 2020. In addition, we conducted a series of 7 focus groups, as well as 2 case studies of mutual aid. So the presentation today is truly comprehensive. I'm not going to be able to touch on every single aspect, but the goal is to give you an overview of how donors of color are participating. So with that, let's go right into the findings. The first finding is probably the most important one. When we think about philanthropy, for a long time, we've used a definition here at the Lilly Family School that it's voluntary action for the public good. But when we look across communities of color, we see that generosity spans race, it spans ethnicity, it's present in every community that we study, but it also is varying across different types of communities. And so the goal here is really to expand our definition of philanthropy and truly bring light and awareness to all the different ways that diverse communities give. And so let's share some of the data that undergirds the study. So first, when we look at typical contributions, so in a given year, what fraction of Americans give, what we find is that households of all different backgrounds are engaged in philanthropy. They're engaged in charitable giving. And when we adjust for economic circumstances, income, education, wealth, a lot of the differences we see by race and ethnicity actually do not hold up. In other words, all Americans are engaged in philanthropy, and generosity is not unique to any one type of American. Americans have a deep tradition of giving, and we see that across Asian households, Black households, Hispanic households, white households, all Americans. In fact, this is probably a finding that needs to be lifted up even more, because in this era where we speak of persistent disparities, we actually note that generosity is something that brings Americans together, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And for all of you who are joining us today, I think this slide really is something that you can take away, share with your colleagues, help our communities and our philanthropic sector and beyond to understand that generosity is deeply embedded. It's a core American value in all of our communities. And so let's go to the next slide. Just as important, we're also finding, and this is a very exciting finding given the events of the last 12 to 18 months, diverse donors are also expanding tools and practices in philanthropy. Over the last year, we've heard this phrase over and over again, that COVID has brought more attention to disparities. But what I have also found inspiring during this time is that the events of 2020 and 2021 have actually lifted up the practices, the approaches, and the tools that are being used by communities around this country to achieve impact and social change. For many communities of color, mutual aid has been very much a longstanding practice. Giving circles have long existed in communities of color, and we found that these tools are being mobilized to drive impact and to achieve lasting effects in many communities around the country. Just to share this data on the next slide, we have it's a bit difficult to see, but what we find is that communities of all different backgrounds are engaged in charitable giving, but they're also engaged in volunteering, in donating goods, in crowdfunding, both via social media, as well as more directly, and donating blood. So this very expansive definition of philanthropy is one that we came to rely on during the pandemic as communities relied on each other to weather the changes and the shifts that were taking place. Volunteering became a key way to distribute goods in communities. Donations of food, of cleaning supplies, and even masks at the start of the pandemic were very important. And we see that communities of all different backgrounds, Asian, Black, Hispanic, white households, and all other ethnic groups were engaged in all of these different forms of giving. On the next slide, I'd also like to share, when we talk about giving behaviors, we also want to emphasize, although all households are engaged in giving, how they give, where they donate to, and the kinds of causes that they support do differ across and by race and ethnicity. In particular, one of the patterns that's actually held up in this data and also other data sources that we study is that communities of color have a strong tradition of giving to religious congregations. In particular, we find that Black and Hispanic households are donating to religious congregations at higher rates than other American groups, and that even when we look over time, this pattern persists. As we go to the next slide, I'd also like to lift up a theme that we have seen more and more of over the last 12 to 18 months, and that is this notion of mutual aid. Scientists have long studied mutual aid, the way that communities support each other. And when we look by race and ethnicity, we see very strong results here that among donors of color, mutual aid, giving to people you know, helping people outside of money, helping strangers, giving to strangers, all of those different forms of giving are found at higher rates in communities of color. What does this mean and why is this important? During the pandemic, mutual aid emerged as a very rapid and effective way to deliver services, to deliver goods, and to meet needs and changing and dynamic needs in communities around this country. And we're finding that larger funders, institutional funders, educational institutions, and nonprofits of all types are finding ways to collaborate with networks of mutual aid in order to deliver support. As an example, one of the case studies in the report looks at collectively local grassroots organizations that helped many funders in the city of Baltimore meet needs during the pandemic. So going forward, there's an opportunity for philanthropy to begin to lift up and partner and collaborate with many of these practices that have long existed in communities of color. On the next slide, I also want to lift up another finding. Technology is playing a growing role for diverse donors. Earlier this year, the Lilly Family School launched a new report on crowdfunding. And one of the things we do in this report on everyday donors of color is a deeper dive into the role that technology plays for diverse donors. We're finding, as many of you know, that more Americans are giving online. They're giving through social media. In fact, for the first time, Giving USA reported that more than 10% of overall giving is taking place online. What we're finding for everyday donors of color is that technology is important. When we look by different measures, awareness of digital tools and platforms, those are very high among donors of color. Donors of color tend to be younger on average, and that's also an important distinction to keep in mind. To share the data on this finding on the next slide, we actually look by ethnic and racial group, and once again note that all ethnic groups that we study have high rates of giving via crowdfunding, giving via social media, and awareness of social media giving, crowdfunding is over 90% across all the different racial and ethnic groups that we study. And then finally, for the very last finding, one of the things we want to just highlight is over the course of the last year, our nation experienced not just a global pandemic and economic shocks, but also a new level of awareness around racial and social justice, a national reckoning on race. And one of the key findings of this report is that donors of color led some of the changes that we see in the giving landscape. Specifically, between 2019 and 2020, we saw an increase in the fraction of American households that gave to racial or social justice. Our study allowed us to conduct focus groups with individuals around the US of all different backgrounds. And this allowed us to have a better understanding of what giving to racial and social justice actually means. It doesn't reside in just one charitable category. It includes giving direct support to individuals and families, support for grassroots organizations and leaders, and finally, nonprofits that are addressing broader issues related to race and social equity, including funding for HBCUs, historically Black-led organizations, Asian American causes, Hispanic businesses, and many other organizations. As we look at the rates of giving to racial and social justice, one very key and important takeaway here is that Black and Asian donors actually led the way in terms of being more likely to give. And we find that donors who support racial and social justice tend to be younger, they tend to be less religious in terms of their profile, and they also exhibit higher levels of trust and willingness to work for the well-being of others. There's so much to share in this report. I encourage all of you to download the actual report and the key findings. We have an executive summary. And so I'd just like to end with some implications. As we sift through the data, there is an opportunity here for all of us to think about what these findings mean for us in our organizations, in the work we do in the philanthropic sector, and even beyond. And I'll just list a few of those takeaways. The most important one to remember, and this is something all of us need to, I think, lean into, is that generosity spans race and ethnicity. It comes in many forms. As we think about how this impacts our work, we need to broaden our definition of giving so that it includes all the different ways that Americans participate in supporting each other and their communities. Finally, in the wake of the pandemic and the national reckoning on race, there is also a need for us to think about building new types of partnerships, which include lifting up practices that have long existed in communities of color. Mutual aid is one of them, giving circles is another. And also realize that as we build this new model of philanthropy, we have an opportunity to bring in new donors of all different backgrounds and to build ultimately a more inclusive and more impactful philanthropic sector. So I will stop here and turn it over to our moderator and our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Una, to you and your team's impressive work on this report and for the opportunity to dive even deeper into what this means for all of us. So we'll spend the balance of our time engaging with our 5 panelists. I'm going to pose a few questions to each panelist, and let's start with Kat, excuse me. Kat, at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy, you're committed to providing knowledge and education to help donors do even more good. We also recognize how limited research is on philanthropy across diverse communities. So Kat, how does research like this report aid in your mission and enable donors to do more good in their communities?
Thanks, Bo. Great question. And I think there are 2 ways in which the kind of research that Una presented both provides important context for our work and also reinforces why there is so much demand for some of the center's work. So when I say that it provides context, one of the biggest misconceptions that we have heard from almost the very beginning of the founding of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy is this notion that high impact philanthropy is something that can only be practiced by large foundations or millionaires and billionaires. And I always say, well, no, if we were only focused on the amount of money, then we would be the Center for High Input Philanthropy, right? Impact intentionally is focused on the change, the positive change in the world that philanthropy can achieve. And for our work, we believe every donor, whether that individual has 5 hours and $1 or $1 billion and can devote themselves full time, every donor can practice high impact philanthropy. And even the title of the report, Everyday Donors, right? Making sure that there is a brighter lens on how all people can contribute, and in our case, practice high impact philanthropy. That's a really important contribution to the field. And then in terms of how it reinforces some of the work that we're currently doing, what Una last spoke about, which is the focus on social and racial justice. The Center for High Impact Philanthropy is based at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Social Policy and Practice. We are the School of Social Justice, Social Impact, Social Innovation. And 2 resources that our team at the center at CHIP will be sharing and making publicly available for free from our website is, the first one is called Talent for Giving, which is how do we build the teams that can create greater positive social impact through philanthropy. And you'll see in that a deep examination of the role that DEI considerations need to play in order for that potential to be achieved. That's Talent for Giving. And then the second is actually a tool, because more and more donors are interested in understanding how what they fund can help dismantle structural inequality. So Choosing Change is another resource that will be made publicly available later this year. And that's to equip donors and professional grant makers to do just that, to address structural inequality.
Really helpful, Kat. Thanks. In Allison's introduction, she mentioned your multiple boards, vice chair of Candid, national board of the Greenlight Fund, and you chair the local Philadelphia Greenlight Fund or board. So based on this volunteer work with these groups, Kat, how do these donor-specific findings that Una shared overlap with the trends that you're seeing in the philanthropic sector over this past year?
Yeah, the findings that were just presented are mirrored by the work and the efforts of both of those institutions that you mentioned that I'm extremely proud to be affiliated with. So I'll start with Candid. As you said, it is the largest source of information for the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. It's the result of a merger between GuideStar and the Foundation Center. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that they tend to associate GuideStar with pulling data from 990s tax filings, and they tend to associate the Foundation Center with data on grants made. But what's happened over the past few decades is that the type of data and the sources of data that Candid can now access, it's really rich. And it's coming from public information, from websites, and increasingly from partnerships. And I'll mention two partnerships in particular. One is, for the past 10 years, Candid has been gathering, cleaning, and coding data from the members of the Human Rights Funders Network. And that is a group dedicated to the kind of racial and social justice that we were just talking about. And the fact that we now have data from that group means that we now have timely available research that everybody can use that now has a very explicit racial justice lens. Another partnership that Candid has is with the Donors of Color Network, right? And so those are donors of color. And what's great about that is because we have DEI fields in the kinds of data Candid captures, we're not only seeing where donors of color, what donors of color are doing in terms of decisions they're making, but we're also seeing to what extent are the organizations they're funding being led by individuals who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So all this means that we can have Candid's work allows for a much richer understanding of our sector and who's participating, and where do we have increased opportunities to activate all of these efforts in the pursuit of social and racial justice. And then with Greenlight Fund, it is exactly the kind of very community-based effort that is often overlooked, frankly, in research and even the sort of media around philanthropy. These Greenlight's model is city-based. The selection advisory boards are drawn from that community. The needs that each fund, and we have funds in Philadelphia, which I chair, in Baltimore, in Boston, where it originated, and across the country, Detroit, et cetera, is those local residents identify what are some of the most pressing needs in those cities. And with centering racial equity in everything we do, try to look for those organizations that we can partner with that can address those priority community needs. And if you look across the history of Greenlight, what you'll find is increasing diversity in who those funders are. We call them our investors. Right, so that the people funding the Greenlight funds look increasingly like the residents of those cities that we're operating in. And the executive directors of each of those funds are deeply embedded in that community. There's a term that I think many people are referring to more and more. We're talking about very proximate leadership. They are of that community. They have grown up in that community. Many of them have relevant lived experience in the very issues that those Greenlight funds are trying to address. And so those are just two great institutions that I'm affiliated with that I think are working towards some of the racial and social justice goals that, that were outlined in the Everyday Donors of Color report.
Super helpful, super impactful, Kat. Thank you ever so much.
Thank
Let's
you.
shift to Dawn Knickerbocker. As Allison mentioned in the introduction, Vice President of Development and External Engagement, Native Americans in Philanthropy. Una talked about the importance of fund distribution to Native donors across both real-time crisis response, as well as supporting long-term economic recovery. So Dawn, how can individuals and teams endeavor to strike that balance and message it accordingly to potential donors?
Thank you, Bo. That's a really excellent question. When striking that balance, it's really important to know and understand who Native nations are as people. Native American Indians and Alaskan Native people represent 2.9% of the US population. 3.7 million people self-identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 5.9 million in combination with one race or more. So we are not a shrinking group. We are not people of the past. We are contemporary cultures. And instead of shrinking, we're actually growing in numbers. We're often lumped into ethnicity or racial groups. And while that is true, we are also a strong political class. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, 60 plus state recognized nations, all with unique histories, cultures, languages, and that share geography with the United States, but each of these having full sovereignty. So as Native people, we are not a monolith. That's first and foremost. And while we have reservations reserved for culture, many do. However, 78% of Native people live off of reservations, and while still being connected with our homelands, our tribal leaders, our communities, and our cultures. And what we at Native Americans and Philanthropy have learned and understand about how Native people distribute funds as everyday donors is that this is based on our Native values of reciprocity, relationships, our responsibility, and ultimately our generosity. And that's what we share with all donors of color. We've been, as Native people, philanthropists from the beginning, since time immemorial. And generosity is what it means to be part of a Native community on reservation or not. So when crises are happening, like the global pandemic, the climate crisis, the racial reckoning that we're seeing, we see a steady flow of money from Native to Native people. We see this through crowdfunding sources and sites like GoFundMe. We also saw and continue to see mutual aid, caravans of people giving food, water, medicine, and other physical resources along with cash resources. We also saw knowledge being shared. There were victory gardens for some people, but there were also medicine gardens. And this kind of traditional knowledge is part of our philanthropy. And what's really reflected in Native Americans in Philanthropy's most recent report on the COVID crisis is that we saw more Native people participating in other giving circles in larger movements to get resources to the ground. And as we learn about who Native people are and how they participate in giving, we should know that sovereignty is a really critical step of understanding, knowing the people and building the relationship with the people. And once those connections are established, it's important to understand that there are Native giving protocols, and you need to work with the communities and the allies within the communities. And we often talk about 7 generations. And what that means to us as Native people is that whatever we do today will impact 7 generations in the future. It impacts our relatives, our land relatives, water, spirit, and all the people that are ahead of us. We're always looking to achieve long-lasting effects. Finally, one of our biggest challenges is our invisibility to the broader public and to the philanthropic sector as a whole. The invisibility, it really allows for harmful misunderstandings about who our communities are, our cultures. It allows for stereotypes and news cycles focus on our deficits and not our strengths. And our strength is, as Native people, is our generosity. And what motivates Native donors to give, especially to earth-related matters, is our relationships and our ability to build power and network with marginalized communities so that we have long-term generational impact.
Super helpful, Don. Thank you so much. You actually answered the second question I had, and looking at the time, I'm gonna move on, but very grateful for your insight. 7 generations, I love that. Let's shift to Pat Ang. Pat is CEO, as Allison mentioned, of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. Pat, drawing further on this idea of alliances, let's talk about the report's finding, love your perspective, that AAPI donors have sought to identify organizations doing solidarity work with both Black and Indigenous people. So Pat, what methods do you most often see your members using to identify and connect with the philanthropic needs and priorities of their communities?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for including me in this webinar and on this exciting topic, and congratulations to the Lilly School and to Dr. Usili for this very important report on donors of color, right? And I'm going to just do a very quick story, because when I read the executive summary, it really brought back to me some of my earliest memories ever. I really remember, and I think it's really helpful to, if it's okay, to share personal stories to really bring data to life. And so for me, growing up, I remember when I was really little, regular visits with other family members who were actually not direct blood relatives, right? I didn't understand when I was little why they were so important to us, or how grateful my parents were to them, and understood later that they helped bring my father, then my mother, to this country, supporting them through money, networks, and other assistance, right? And there were family associations or mutual aid networks that supported the whole community through restrictive immigration laws, which is a topic for a whole nother, it's a different topic that we won't go into, but really restrictive immigration laws that banned Chinese from immigrating. And so, as a result of lifting of restrictive immigration quotas in 1965, I always thought, why bother? This is so old-fashioned, these family associations. What value do they hold? But over time, I understood that I was part of a larger community beyond my immediate family, that whatever I did was a result of and a reflection of this larger community, and that each of us have a responsibility to pay it forward. And so for me, through that experience, I learned to center people, not money. I think, that families with and without a lot of money, given so many different forms, as so many different people have said, and I think we need to really right-size our perspective. Giving by people with less money is significantly more than more generous, proportionate to their individual means, right? So philanthropy is the love of humanity, not money. And I always really want to reiterate that, because I think it's really important to right-size a perspective and to remember that. And to me, that is the power of community giving. In this country, we tend to focus on the individual, not the communities that we're part of. They're not just background, they are the foreground. for who we each are and how we're interconnected. And so for me, now, starting as we saw with the pandemic, Asian American communities bore an early and unique brunt of racist discrimination and violence. It's linked to the unfounded notion that Chinese are responsible for the spread of COVID. We saw that right over the past year and a half. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder last year, and then the murders of Korean women in Georgia, Asian American activism has risen to a new level, including greater and new giving patterns, as I think this report is demonstrating. It was really exciting to see that about a third of Asian Americans were more likely to give to social justice organizations. And we can see why Black Americans and Asian Americans have been so moved, right? So back to your question, which asked, how they identify and connect with needs in the community. It's all about lived experience. This is not about being on the outside looking in, but about being part of what is happening around us. And I think that in this newer moment of racial reckoning, our communities always rise to the challenge. And that is part of surviving and thriving. And so, as noted in the report, Asian Americans, I think it also talked about particularly younger Asian Americans, are joining giving circles to build community and pool funding. There are examples, several API funds and giving circles have raised money to support Black-led organizations working on racial justice. There are some giving circles that recently launched as solidarity funds using principles of trust-based philanthropy, governed by community advisory groups of Black and Indigenous community leaders to make funding decisions and to help build an investment and grantee pipeline. So those are some of the ways that I think we're connecting and using that information.
Super helpful, Pat. My 4 takeaways: stories bring data to life, as you open with. Absolutely. Right size the perspective, lived experience, and focus not on the individual, but on the community. Thank you so much. Looking at our time, I'm going to keep us moving. Move to Jeannie Sager. You'll recall Jeannie's the director of Women's Philanthropy Institute at the Lilly School of Philanthropy. So Jeannie, the report focuses on donors of color, and your work focuses on how gender shapes giving behavior. So Jeannie, what intersections, given this, are you seeing in trends across your research and the research in this report, please?
Thank you so much, Bo. So my initial response to your question is that the motivation behind the research is similar, right? So women have resources to donate and are often overlooked. Donors of color are in a similar position. And of course, as we all know, intersectionalities matter. So women of color, for example, would be even more overlooked as donors. So encouraging the sector to change its approach to these groups is why both WPI and the Mays Institute and this research is so important. This report aligns with findings across our research, but in particular with recent Women Give reports from 2019 and 2020. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with our work, Women Give is WPI's signature report that we produce annually. And in 2019, we looked at the intersection of race, gender, and giving. And in 2020, at the intersection of technology, gender, and giving. In both of these reports, we found that emphasizing an expansive definition of philanthropy resonates with women donors, as it does in the Everyday Donors of Color report. Women and diverse donors tend to give more than money, using their time, expertise, advocacy, and networks to apply all of their resources to work for good. And this is especially important for communities of color, where women, and as we see in this latest report, donors of color, can be seen as bridge builders within philanthropy, truly embracing a rich and broad definition of generosity and using their giving to celebrate and support their communities. As Pat shared, such an important piece to a donor of color's experience and lived experience. Another through line from our research on women as donors and this new report is an interest and preference for collective giving and the draw to the community that results from philanthropy. This report highlights the important role, again, of giving circles and how giving circles have played for donors of color communities and have proven to be transformative experiences, much like they have been for women. The Giving Circle movement has up to now been largely women-led, and these giving circles have allowed for what we like to call a democratization of philanthropy through participatory grant making, providing leadership opportunities for women, and insightful learning experiences that to better understand the communities in which they live and address systemic structures for change. And lastly, as our Women Give 2020 report highlights, women are using technology as a driver for philanthropy, similarly to what this new report shares about donors of color and their use of technology. Given this preference for what we like to call tech for good, organizations need to provide donors with tools that align with their giving preferences. For example, helping to curate causes, connecting donors to organizations, and again, can't say this enough, expanding the definition of philanthropy beyond just dollars. Additionally, fostering the culture of community by exploring technological innovations that augment community outside of in-person experiences. Moreover, next week, WPI will release a new report on gender and crowdfunding that will provide additional information about how women, like the donors of color in this report, have added crowdfunding as a new tool in their giving toolbox.
Jeannie, fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Very, very helpful information. So we'll move to Dr. Frederick, Wayne Frederick, president of Howard University. Dr. Frederick, a couple of concluding questions to this conversation. The study, as we heard from Una Osili, found that universities, Dr. Frederick, are a core giving area for donors of color, and that much of this is attributed to their commitment to helping future generations succeed. So in your conversations with Howard University donors, curious how you communicate gift impact, please.
Yeah, I'll say the first thing is trying to make sure that they can relate that to their own experience. There's no doubt that education is the economic escalator of our time. If we look at the largest number of people that you want to move from one station to another via upward mobility, clearly education has been that economic escalator. And I think in a lot of the donors of color's life, that impact that someone else's philanthropy had on them is where we try to connect. I think what's interesting in Una's study as well is that Black donors were far more likely than any other segment studied to give to their churches and religious organizations. And I think that's another important factor. So connecting the social good, as it were, that our universities can do by transforming lives is the other area that I try to connect the two and bring some intersectionality to the conversation. That the more young people that we can matriculate and ultimately graduate, the more that will go out into the society and influence it in a good way. Our motto is truth and service, so I try to really focus and double down on that aspect of what we do in connecting with these donors.
Thank you so much. Let me take that a step further, if I could. How, Dr. Frederick, do you customize your approach in these conversations with your donors, specifically your financial prospects of color?
Yeah, I think Una's, I would also say that what Una presented as well from that study is that there is wealth and there is capacity within there. But what I think she underscored that's just as important is the fact that you want people to give just as much of their time as they give of their treasure. And that's important. So the other thing that we do in terms of customization is we often have opportunities for these donors to meet with the group of students they support in a mentoring capacity. And we find that the fulfillment that donors get from that is absolutely incredible. So while we may have scholars named after a particular person, that person actually meeting with them once a semester, talking to them, not just about the classes they have, but the ambitions that they have. We're very focused on students fulfilling their mission versus just their major. And so all of that participation and giving donors that opportunity for that engagement is very, very fulfilling. So they see freshmen who they've helped all the way to graduation, and they keep those connections going forward. And I think ultimately that amplification of someone else's humanity is the embodiment of the philanthropy as was defined earlier.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question to conclude our conversation. Dr. Frederick, the report reminds us that moving forward toward a more diverse and inclusive team starts with an internal look, looking from within. And I mentioned this, from hiring and recruiting practices to training existing teams, self-reflection, awareness, and all the rest. So concluding advice for all of us, Dr. Frederick, could you provide us thoughts? What would you leave everyone joining us today who are on this journey to elevate their donors to a more equitable future? Any final words of wisdom would be wonderful.
Yeah, I think we have to start with what we started with Allison, the definition of philanthropy. And, that's where I would like us to end. It ultimately is about providing dignity and grace, and in many ways amplifying someone's humanity. So I think if we focus on the impact that can be had, and also emphasize that it's not just about dollars, but it is about people's time and their energy, and they expect them to also be smart. That's that's not an Einstein moment. That's just a fact. And I think we don't often tap into that aspect of what they bring to the table. So I think it's an opportunity to do that, and they're doing it for reasons that come from within. And I think if we can spread more of that grace around, we would definitely have much more of an impact and elevate them in a better way.
Thank you so much. With dignity, with grace, and focus on the impact. Very helpful to everyone. So we'll conclude in our last 2 minutes. Cannot thank Una Osili and her Lilly Family School of Philanthropy colleagues enough. Thank you so much again. We thank our panelists, Pat Ang, Dr. Wayne Frederick, Dawn Knickerbocker, Kat Rosqueta, and Jeannie Sager. Echoing Una, we're very grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding the report, and of course to each of you. I noticed we had at one time over 800 attendees, so we're very, very grateful to each of you. As shared earlier in the chat, the recording from today's session will be sent to you via email this week. You'll also have the opportunity to join us for part 2 of this conversation later this fall, and more information on that will follow. So to everyone engaged in this first session, we cannot thank you enough. Many, many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your week, your summer, and we're very grateful. All the best.